Now, I should have done this a couple of days ago, but I forgot. Things came up and whatnot, and I didn't have internet yesterday because of the bombing of the internet service provider, and so I forgot to do this video that I wanted to do about the Russian bond default. Oh man, that's goddamn funny. So this is the long and short of it. Okay. See, the Russians, like any sovereign government, went out and borrowed money because lots of times it's just useful to borrow money for different purposes. Just like you, for instance, you've got the money, but a lot of times you use a credit card because it's more convenient, and you're going into debt for certain expenses because reasons. It's just convenient for whatever reason. So the Russian sovereign nations in general are no different. And Russia, of course, went into sovereign debt. It issued bonds and sold those bonds off and got cash and did whatever with that cash. And of course, it was making bond payments, interest payments or whatever kind of payments that were necessary for the bonds, just determined by the description of those bonds. And because of the sanctions, and because the United States government and the European governments froze Russian assets and Russian foreign currency reserves, there was a possibility that Russia was going to go into default, right? Default is a very serious business. When you miss a payment, your creditors get very nervous. Of course they do. And so because of this, and because a lot of the creditors of Russian sovereign debt were American institutions of various sorts, and also European, but to a lesser extent. A lot of it was just institutional money. That is pension funds had gotten into Russian sovereign debt because it was very attractive. It had a very high yield for reasons that aren't important. But the point. See, the Russians, with their sovereign currency, foreign currency reserves, they had the cash to pay, to make payments on the bonds, no problem. But because of the sanctions, their money was essentially stolen by the European and American governments, right? Because basically, you can't touch your own money. Then they basically stole it from you, right? But there were these waivers that were created for the sanctions, whereby Russia could make bond payments. Okay, all good and fine. And then a couple of days ago, the Biden administration revoked that waiver to force Russia into defaulting on its bonds. And this seems like a terrible thing, right? Well, obviously I'm laughing, and it's not a terrible thing, not for the Russians. It's terrible for the Americans and the Europeans, and I'll explain why. You see, why do you want to have a good credit rating? Why? Because you want to borrow money at some point in the future. So you want to make sure that your credit rating is really tip-top right now, so that tomorrow and next year or whenever you can borrow money and get a fairly good interest rate, right? That's the point of it. But see, if you are cut off from the financial system, what does your credit rating matter? You see my point? See, the Russians have been cut off of the Western financial system altogether. They can't issue bonds in the United States or Europe. Even if they wanted to, they can't, okay? Because they've been cut off. So if they were to issue bonds and sell these bonds, well, because the Russian banks have been cut off, including the Russian central bank, any money that they got for selling these bonds, well, the Russians would not get them. So it doesn't matter. You got to understand what's going on here. The Americans, by cutting off the Russian banks and by stealing their assets, basically it's like you have a mortgage payment with a bank, and the mortgage issuing bank seizes your bank account where you have $20,000. You can easily make the payment on whatever payment you have to make for your mortgage, but they say, oh, well, I have your account, you can't make any payments, and therefore I'm going to declare bankruptcy on you. I'm going to haul you in front of the court. And you'd be like, what are you talking about? I've got the money. I want to make the payment. You're not letting me. Right? That's the situation. And see, the Americans have done this to the Russians, and there's that legal point. And on the other hand, since they have cut off the Russians from the Western financial system, and so therefore for the foreseeable future, or for at least the next few years, Russia will not be able to float bonds and sell those bonds in the US market or European markets, then it doesn't matter to the Russians. See? It doesn't matter if they default. Because their rating could be just shit, just the most awful rating ever. And so what? They can't borrow money from the West. And on top of that, they don't need to. That's a key issue. Because remember, as I said at the beginning, you borrow money sometimes because it's convenient. But, you don't have to do it. Like, for instance, you use your MasterCard for whatever, to pay for some tickets because, you have the money, but you have it tied up saying, like, you put it in some stocks or some bonds or whatever, some certificates of deposit. So if you take them out, you'll lose a little money. And so that's why you figure, I'll just use a credit card because it'll be cheaper. The interest rate is less money than I'll spend than, say the penalty clause for taking out the money from my CD is, that kind of thing. It's just a matter of convenience, right? Well, the Russians, same thing. They got plenty of money, and they're making even more money with the sanctions that have driven up the commodity prices around the world. I mean, the Russians are swimming in money. Okay, they really are. Again, so the issue becomes, you see, the Russians don't need to borrow money from the West. They'll get along fine and dandy without ever borrowing money from the West. And so who's holding Russian debt, Russian bonds? Well, American institutions. I heard one of the holders, a big holder, is some teacher's pension fund out in like Kansas or someplace like that, okay? I mean, all kinds of weird people have it. I mean, weird people, not in the literal sense weird in the sense like, you wouldn't have thought it. But yeah, because it has a very good yield, those bonds do. And so a lot of people got into them because it was a reasonable investment. Now, these people, they're owed money by the Russian government. But the Russian government, well, first of all, they're not in the United States. And even if you could reach them, because of the sanctions they're not in the United States, right? Even if you can reach them, they will tell you the following. They'll tell you, we will happily pay you. We want to pay you, but our money is frozen by your government. So take it up with a judge in your country. It's not our problem. You see? And those bondholders, they're going to look at the books of the Russians and they're going to see, oh yeah, the Russians do have plenty of cash in their account with JP Morgan. But it's the US federal government that is not allowing Russia to pay its bonds. And it keeps saying that it wants to pay the bonds. And previous to these sanctions, they had paid on time, every time. And so a bondholder in the States, a bondholder in Europe, he's going to sue the government. Of course, because it's the government that is preventing this payment. It's not the Russians. The Russians have every intention, and they have said so. And even if they didn't have the intention, see, the bondholder can go to court and get a lien on some of the money of that account that the Russians have. And so the Russians couldn't walk away. But because of the sanctions and the fact that the American government has, the technical term is sequestered the money of the Russians, those bondholders in the States and in Europe, they can't legally get the money that they're owed. The money that they would get even if Russia didn't want to pay them, even if Russia went bankrupt, hypothetically, of course, the bondholders would still get at least a chunk of that money. But because of the sanctions and the rules of sequestership, these bondholders in the States, they're getting zero. They're getting fucked over in a huge way. And they're pissed. And so who are they going to go to for legal remedy? They're going to go to the courts. And what are they going to ask the courts? They're going to say, the American government is causing this problem. And a lot of these bondholders, Russian bondholders in the States and Europe, they have a lot of political weight. And so all of a sudden, this problem becomes to snowball. And it's all because the Biden administration wanted to seem that they're really pushing the sanctions. But they don't seem to realize that they're only hurting themselves. And that's kind of like the story of the whole sanctions regime. All of this stuff hurts the Americans and the Europeans far more than it hurts the Russians. For the Russians, it's more like an annoyance. And on top of that, Because of the sanctions, commodity prices have gone through the roof. The Russians are making more money than ever before, and they're not even pumping out more oil. It's the same, and in some cases, it's a reduced capacity, certainly a reduced capacity insofar as natural gas is concerned, and they're making more money than before. See, this is the problem, man. This is what happens with a gang that can't shoot straight or can't think. See, the American administration, it's filled with a bunch of people who are imbeciles, who are reactionary, emotional reactionaries. I mean that literally. They react based strictly on emotion. They don't use rationality. They don't use logic. They don't seem to put themselves in the position of their opposing number. They just lash out like children. It really is like children. I mean, I've had to deal with small children. I have small children. Well, they're not so small anymore. I mean, 7 and 9, but the point remains. See, small children lash out emotionally because they're small children. They have a good excuse, they're babies. Of course, babies and toddlers and small children are going to lash out emotionally. That's all they know because they're small. There's no excuse for adults to be acting this way, but that's what the Biden administration has done. They've acted emotionally, stupidly, and they are only hurting themselves, their own cause, and they're actually helping the Russians. Understand what's going on.